Batya, what's on your radar today?
So, Brianna, after a bank run on Silicon Valley Bank left the institution in ruins, the Federal Reserve announced it will make whole the bank's customers, including those whose deposits were larger than $250,000, which should have made them ineligible for the Deposit Insurance Fund. President Biden promised the American people that this was not a bailout because no losses would be borne by taxpayers, a claim the Wall Street Journal assessed as a whopper. But an equally important debate we should be having is not the argument of definition over what to call the Fed's actions, but how to judge them morally, especially given how the Fed has been trying to tame inflation for the past 2 years. After all, it's a truth universally acknowledged by economist types that by and large, inflation and unemployment have an inverse relationship, they tell us. Open any economic textbook and you'll learn that when unemployment drops and wages rise, so does inflation. Higher unemployment, they tell us, and lower working class wages mean lower inflation. That is explicitly why the Fed has been raising interest rates of late, to cool the economy in the hopes that higher interest rates will lower investment and lead to less hiring, less wage growth for the working class, and even unemployment, and thereby lesser inflation. The stubbornness of the current red-hot jobs market and the incredible wage gains by working Americans have been greeted with dismay by economists who see this as the only way to combat inflation. Of course, inflation hurts the working class most of all, and finding ways to tame it is crucial to a monetary policy that works for working Americans. But there is something deeply jarring about the fact that the Fed's policy of raising interest rates hurts the people whose ability to thrive is most crucial to the stability of our nation, targeting working class wages and first-time homeowners. In other words, throwing a bomb on the pathway to the middle class. A more equitable society, one more finely attuned to the well-being of the working class and the importance of upward mobility, would look for ways to tame inflation that targeted those who could best afford it. A Fed that worked for the middle class and the working class would look for ways to tamper investments that didn't directly make it impossible for people to buy a home, the hallmark of the American dream. A Fed that cared about the bottom wouldn't be hoping to see fewer new jobs posted every month, hoping for less wage growth, hoping for millions of Americans to get laid off. There are ways to tamp inflation that don't involve targeting the working class. As you might recall from Econ 101, inflation is too much demand chasing too few goods. Instead of targeting the demand side, the Biden administration could be targeting the supply side on energy, say, or reshoring manufacturing to target supply chain issues, something Biden has at least been talking about, to his credit. Indeed, a more perfect way to get billions of dollars out of the economy fell into the Fed's lap when Silicon Valley Bank failed. Suddenly, a host of millionaire investors and CEOs had their funds dry up, their companies wiped out by an old-fashioned bank run. You couldn't have designed a better way to combat inflation that targeted those at the top if you tried, those most likely to rebound, those least at risk of downward mobility. SVB's customers were tech startups, biotech firms, winemakers, and Chinese businesses, the kind of people who raise money from venture capitalists for a living, the well-heeled and the well-connected. Unfortunately, they are also exactly the kind of people the Democratic Party caters to these days. Recall that 98% of political contributions from the internet companies went to Democrats in 2020, which is why there was never a chance in hell the Biden administration was going to let these people flounder. Instead, once again, the Biden administration chose what the Wall Street Journal called an income transfer from average Americans to deep-pocketed investors, as they always do. This should be a moment of clarity. It is deeply telling that the Fed has been raising interest rates with the explicit hopes that it will cause thousands, if not millions of Americans to stop seeing wage growth and even lose their jobs to cool the economy, while also deciding to put billions back into it, bailing out millionaires. The Fed has been making it impossible for middle-class Americans to buy homes, raising interest rates to slow investment and cool the market. And then when a bunch of millionaires lose their investments and may have to close their companies, the Fed decided to pay them back to stay open. Just as they were asked to bear the brunt of the burden of the COVID lockdowns while elites saw their home prices skyrocket, when it comes to the Democrats' monetary policy, it is middle and working class Americans who are consistently asked to pay for getting inflation under control with unaffordable housing, unemployment, and slower wage growth. Yet when millionaires might lose some of their money, their assets must be protected to safeguard the economy. All the debates about whether you call this a bailout or not, or taxpayer funded or not, or deposits versus investments are less important than that fundamental juxtaposition, which is just rotten to its core and tells you a lot about who the Democrats' real base is. So, Brianna, I'm sure you are with me on this rant.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think it's disgusting and an incredible tell how quickly the government acts to bail out the rich. They did this in the context of the housing crisis. And despite the fact that there was a lot of public pressure to at least allot funds that could be distributed to help bail out homeowners, those TARP funds were largely never distributed. And we see this over and over again. And in instances like that, it's particularly galling because you see large percentages of the population who have real electoral power being ignored by the political class of both parties. And so the kind of assessment that we live in a democracy and that politicians at the end of the day are beholden to votes is really undermined by the reality that it's clearly not just the votes, it's the money. And when small groups of people have an extreme amount of money, then that's what really talks. You mentioned that, majority of the people who bank in Silicon Valley and people in California obviously are Democrats and give to the Democratic Party. That's absolutely true. The majority of labor also supports Democrats in this country and supported Joe Biden, but they are easily thrown under the bus by the Democratic Party because those dollars don't talk in the same way as the enormous sums that are raised from Silicon Valley. And this is an issue that regrettably is not a partisan one. We have two corporate parties in the United States of America, and I have no doubt in my mind that if this were to happen under Donald Trump, who of course passed the biggest tax cuts for the rich in American history, 85% of every dollar of which went to the top 1% of earners in this country. I shouldn't even call them earners, wealth havers in this country, then the same thing would have happened. So what is there to do? I think that we need to be having a much more robust conversation about getting money out of politics. And that's a conversation that's not going to happen with just support of the left or just support of the right. There was a bipartisan decision to kind of disengage from that conversation during the Obama years when Obama realized how much money he could raise from places like, yes, Silicon Valley, and gave up on all of the rhetoric he used to say about campaign finance reform.
And tying into your radar, started to talk about a lot of, issues related to people's identities instead. I will say
that Barack Obama actually, I think, was savvy to know that he, especially as a black man, should stay away from that stuff. I think that the world kind of forced a lot of that on him, calling him a Muslim, not that that is a slur, but it wasn't true of him, saying things about his disparaging comments about his wife. People still, for lack of a better word, misgender Michelle Obama all the time. So he was, I think, forced into a lot of those conversations and learned his lesson with the whole cop sit-down conversation after the cop that arrested Henry Louis Gates in front of his own house to not try to wade in those waters. But Black Lives Matter as a movement emerged during the Obama tenure, I think, in response to real life hostilities that existed between the police and black communities and real life killings of black people that had happened. And so there's a certain extent to which I think we shouldn't confuse, talking about identity to distract from real political and economic issues and people who are bringing up real economic issues and personal issues like being murdered by the cops, because those are concerns that they're facing in the reality of life.
Could not agree more. And one of the things that has been most heartening to see is how bipartisan that conversation is turning into being. We will have more Rising right after this.